Good afternoon and welcome to our Ask Her webinar series. This is Claudia Williams. I'm a program officer at Washington Area Women's Foundation, and I am so glad to see so many of you joining today for what I know will be a great conversation. The Washington Area Women's Foundation is a community-supported foundation that invests in the power and potential of women and girls of color. And we created the Ask Her interview series so our friends and supporters can hear directly from amazing women leaders who are doing great work to change things for women and girls of color. But we also want you to ask questions and engage in conversation with them. So please feel free to drop your questions on the chat box as you think of them, and we will come back to them before we wrap up the panel. During this conversation, we will be centering racial, gender, and economic justice. For us, it's so important to elevate these topics and to make sure that we look at what happens at the intersections of race and gender. Today, we will chat about what philanthropy and policymakers can do to support the needs of the caregiving workforce, and also how can we support them during the pandemic. We have with us today Ai-jen Poo, Executive Director and founder of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and Fatima Goss, President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center. They have both devoted their careers to improve things for women and girls. Ai-jen has been organizing immigrant women workers for over 20 years with the objective of supporting them to access better paying jobs and better working conditions. And Fatima has been working to eliminate barriers so women can access better employment, education, health, and reproductive rights. Thank you so much for being with us today and welcome.
Thank you, Claudia. We're so excited about this. And thanks to everyone at the Washington Area Women's Foundation. What a beautiful community.
I'm so glad to be with all of you guys and to be with my friend Ai-jen.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So to start the conversation, I was wondering if we can start by defining what we mean by the care workforce so everyone in our audience knows more about what we're talking, and also why it is so critical. Why is the work so critical at this time?
Well, the care workforce is the large and growing workforce of mostly women and mostly women of color who work in childcare and long-term care. So they are the home care workers who take care of our aging parents and people with disabilities. They are the direct care workers who are working in long-term care facilities. They are the child care workers and early childhood educators and nannies who we count on to nurture the potential of our children every single day. And it's work that really does make everything else possible. I know there's probably a lot of parents and family caregivers listening in today, and I think you all know just how important this work is in all of our lives and for our families.
Well, the only thing I would add to what Ai-jen just said is it really, one of the things she often says is it's the work that makes all other work possible. And in this period where in so many ways our systems that were already vulnerable crumbled, and that was true for our care infrastructure, right now there's a lot of unpaid caregivers who are really worried about what they're going to do in an ongoing way and how they're going to be able, and whether they're going to be able to stay in their jobs. So right now you have parents and families really, really struggling as this care crisis has been brought to them on top of all of the other crises that they're facing.
Yeah, and it's revealed just how important the workforce is that has supported us all along, but that we've never adequately supported or invested in as a really sustainable profession where you can take pride in the work that you do and support and care for your own families and loved ones. And so that is, I think, the opportunity before us is how do we actually support our care workforce in a whole new way in this era?
Thank you so much for sharing that. This definitely resonates with us. At the Women's Foundation, we are very interested in advancing women and girls of color, and we know if we want to support them in any way, we need to be paying attention to the care workforce. And as you were sharing, the pandemic has really highlighted the very precarious job conditions that care workers have, and there's so much work that we can do to change it. And I know organizing is so important to ask for change. So I was wondering, Ai-jen, if you can share with us, how did you become an organizer for care workers? How did you become an organizer for care workers?
Well, in the mid-90s, I was volunteering at a domestic violence shelter for Asian immigrant women, and I worked on the hotline, and a number of the women who called the hotline, they were, of course, in crisis as survivors of violence in their lives, and they were also in crisis because the work that they didn't allow them to actually pay the bills and make ends meet and put food on the table for their kids and to create a pathway to a new life and a new beginning. And I just thought it was so extraordinary that you have so many women, especially women of color, who are working incredibly hard and still not able to make ends meet. And many of them were working as care workers. And so that call to action, that question of how is it that we have so many women who are working and still can't care for their families, is a question that kind of stuck with me. And so in 1998, when I was a part of an Asian community organization called the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, we started doing a lot of outreach to women in those low-wage service jobs. And the women who kept coming to the meetings were domestic workers who, I think, because they work in such isolated conditions, right, hidden behind closed doors in unmarked households and apartment buildings all over the country, they really understood the power of community and collective and organizing. And they would come to the health fairs and the Know Your Rights workshops and the regular meetings, and that work built and it became multiracial in New York City. And we started connecting with organizers at the grassroots level in cities all over the country, including Washington. And together we joined forces in 2007, and about 50 organizers and domestic workers from around the country launched the National Domestic Workers Alliance together at that time to create a new vehicle and voice for domestic workers to be powerful. And it was a lot of nannies and childcare workers and caregivers who were at the founding, at the center of this movement throughout, and continue to power us forward.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're all adapting to new ways of working, and I can imagine that's the same for you and for people that are organizing. So I was wondering if you can share with us what organizing looks like during social distancing.
Well, organizing at its heart is about building trust and relationships, and through that process, building power together. And that can happen lots of different ways. I think, it has happened in communities and church basements and community centers for decades, and now it's happening online. It's happening through social media platforms. It's happening through Zoom calls. We have at least 5 or 6 national calls that bring workers together per week, and people have been incredibly engaged because I think that everyone in our own ways in this time feel isolated. And I think having organizations that are communities and essentially like extended families, networks of support, has been such a critical lifeline, especially for women of color who are on the front lines of every aspect of the pandemic. And so we've heard from so many women in our community that having NDWA, having this community, has been one of the most important keys to resilience through this pandemic. And I think organizing is stronger than ever in this time.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. I was wondering, what is the role of organizations like the National Women's Law Center to support organizing? So Fatima, I was wondering if you can share with us a little bit of what the National Women's Law Center is doing to support care workers to get organized so they can negotiate better pay and better working conditions.
Well, so the National Women's Law Center has a few different types of ways in which we work. Some of the work we do, we have law in the name, so we do litigate and take on cases. But the way we think about when we decide to get involved in a case, is whether or not it is really furthering our long-term goals. So is this the sort of case that could either upend a bad rule or help organize people together for change? We also do a lot of research. And again, the way that we think about our research is this the sort of thing that can help to shape a narrative or move policymakers in a particular way? And for our workplace research, we're especially focused on women-dominated jobs, including care jobs, both in terms of care workers and the stories that they have to tell, and helping to partner with groups like NDWA to provide platforms for other people to share their stories and experiences, but also research that is just hard data that can be hard to find. Part of what the challenge is for care workers is making their experiences visible. They have been so left out of our laws and policies and even understanding of work that a radical act is getting out of the way and creating space and mechanisms for them to tell their stories. And then the last thing is that I will just name, and we do this work always in deep partnership with folks who like NDWA, who are organizing directly workers on the ground, is fighting really for law and policy change. And that includes meaningful advocacy at the federal, state, and local levels, and pairing unusual partners. We do a lot of work around childcare in particular, but from all sides, right? We do work on childcare in part because childcare workers are largely women, as Ai-jen said, largely women of color. But we also do work on childcare because it is sort of the make or break thing for women to be able to fully participate in the workforce. And that includes care workers, right? And so so the solutions have to really consider each of these things in mind. And there are possibilities to do that when you actually look holistically at systems to ensure that people are paid wages that are fair and that have pathways and track, and that families are able to get the care that they need in ways that don't put them on the brink or deeper into poverty. And everyone there typically, if done right, can have a shared goal.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add, I can't emphasize enough how important the role of the National Women's Law Center is to organizations like ours. There are so few organizations that are solely focused on how do we uplift women, especially women of color, everyday working women in our law and policy. And the National Women's Law Center, there's no one better at thinking about how we pull those levers to help women like domestic workers be powerful in our law and policy. And so it's absolutely, when I think about who our co-conspirators and most important collaborators are, it's always Fatima and her team. And we're working on all kinds of things to uplift the care workforce right now, including bringing together childcare advocates, elder care, long-term care advocates, paid leave advocates, to work together on how we strengthen this care infrastructure that we have so needed, right? That doesn't actually work in the current, as has been revealed by this pandemic. This is an opportunity for us to all join forces and push for real investments in our care systems that support the families who need care and the workforce, who is the backbone of this infrastructure. So just a shout out to Fatima and her leadership and the whole team over there, because it's essential, their work.
This is so great to hear. I know the work of the National Women's Law Center is so critical, and now, Ai-jen, you are really highlighting that. And there are several components that you need really to launch a successful campaign and to support organizers in the ground. So I was wondering, what other type of, so at the Women's Foundation, we are very interested in healing and resilience. And we know that community organizers are the first responders, that they are definitely in the ground when crisis hits. And while they are leading the way in transforming society, they also don't have necessarily enough time and space to heal from intergenerational trauma or to support their resilience. So I was wondering, Ai-jen, if you can share with us, how is that your organization is supporting care workers, so not only they win policy change, but they also support their healings and resilience?
Yeah, no, that's such an important question. And I have a couple of thoughts on it. One is that, we are in a moment of unprecedented crisis in terms of the dramatic loss of jobs and income that women of color are facing, like domestic workers. And so we do, as an organization, really do need to think about how we're responding to the urgent basic needs of the women that we work with. And one of the things we've done is establish an emergency assistance fund for domestic workers who are directly affected by the pandemic. It's called the Coronavirus Care Fund. And we've been able to make cash payments to domestic workers most of whom have been left out by any of the federal relief that's been available thus far. And here we are just months into this pandemic, and there's no end in sight. And so we need to continue to double down on those efforts to help people just survive at a fundamental level this time. And I'll also say that we have created some tools, because we've heard time and time again just how emotionally and mentally taxing and impossible this time is. And so we've created a peer-to-peer emotional support text line called Care Together that is available, where we have social workers and therapists who are on hand all the time to respond in real time to people who need someone to chat with and to connect to in a time of need and desperation. And so we are thinking really proactively about how are we supporting the mental and emotional and spiritual well-being of people who are really on the front lines of what's happening right now. And then the last thing I'll say is Fatima and I work really closely with Tarana Burke and Monica Ramirez around supporting survivors. And this question of healing has been a question that we have been really thinking about and grappling with, because there's so much healing to do. And one of the things that Tarana says that is so important to me is that there is action is healing, and there is a way in which healing is also action, right? And so too often, I think in our movements, we think about healing as something you do over here on your own, kind of as an individual, and action as something that you do more collectively and in community. And I think what Tarana is calling us to do is really think about how collective action can be a part of the healing process, and that action also requires healing. and that healing in and of itself is an important part of the action that we must take in order to get to the solutions that we know we need and deserve. And so just really breaking down those barriers between healing and action and thinking about how we do both together and think about how they're really connected in a new way.
If I could just add, I think that last point in many ways has been transformative for me, because I tend to think about our work, you know, you have a policy aim, you have a campaign that's driving towards it, and having people interrupt your planning and strategy to sort of say, what along the pathway is allowing for healing is a really important question, and it's provocative and pushes us all. I also just want to name that there's something sort of modest that Ai-jen raised in the storytelling of how quickly and importantly it was that she set up that fund, that first fund, in the days where there was a lot of folks who were frozen about what it is to do, and understanding that she couldn't wait for Congress to get it right, for state and local governments to get it right, for a population they've never gotten it right for, when people were in such immediate and deep need. You know, it's as if we fell off a cliff, and for many, many workers in this country, they went from having a wage to having no wage, and waiting the many months for Congress to get their act together could not be the only strategy. We still have a strategy to get Congress to do the right thing, to fulfill their obligation, to meet the needs of people in this moment, but even beginning to let people know that there is some level of support was so critical at a time of so much pain.
Thank you. We were also very inspired by the work that the National Domestic Workers Alliance is doing, and the Women's Foundation launched the Stand Together Fund. And we are also partnering with grantee partners here in the Washington, D.C. region to provide direct cash assistance to care workers, because we too thought that this was a fundamental care workforce that was being overlooked by our policymakers. So here we are, and we hope that we can continue supporting care workers. You both have mentioned that we have a small window of opportunity to change things and to protect the care workforce. So I wanted to ask both of you, what's next? How can we take advantage of what we are experiencing right now and then turn these unprecedented times into public policies that really support care workers and their families, and at the same time, the care needs of families?
Well, I think that we can think about the opportunities on multiple time horizons. And immediately, I think that it is a huge opportunity that there is kind of this majoritarian awakening to just how essential care workers are. And I mean, it's nothing short of a miracle for us, because we've been saying that this is the work that makes all other work possible for a very long time. And we stand on the shoulders of generations of domestic workers and care workers, especially Black women, who have organized to call attention to the importance of this work and how undervalued it is. And now we have everyone's attention. And so I think, you know, in addition to the recognition and the applause that care workers are getting right now, we need to take action. And in the immediate, I think essential workers, care workers are essential workers. And I think we need to protect essential workers who are still working through this pandemic. The pandemic is ongoing. You know, as much as we would like for it to not be the truth or the case, it is ongoing, it's raging on. And care workers and other essential workers still don't have premium pay, still don't have health care, still don't have PPE and childcare for their own families. And it's unconscionable. So I think immediately we've got to protect our care workers and all of our essential workers as we continue to navigate this pandemic. And then I think in the kind of slightly longer horizon, as we start to think about and imagine the path towards economic recovery, I think it's without question that care jobs and our care infrastructure are our first order of business to invest in. That if we invest in care jobs, becoming living wage jobs with benefits, not only does that benefit and secure this workforce for themselves and their own families, but it benefits everyone else because these are job enabling jobs. These care jobs make it possible for the rest of us, especially working women, to participate in the workforce and be a part of our economic recovery. So big investments in our care infrastructure and systems in a way that really invests in the workforce is, I think, top of the agenda for economic recovery. And I know Fatima has other ideas too.
Well, I would just say yes to everything that Ai-jen said, and add two more things. One of the things that became extraordinarily clear is that our care system was also fragile, especially around childcare. And it's not clear on the other side, whatever we decide is the other side of this pandemic, we're clearly not there yet, that we will have lost almost half of child care centers, to name one example, if we do not do a major investment right now. And these are not sort of bounce back type of very small businesses or even individuals working in the work. And so part of what we really have to do is both the short-term stabilization and infusion, but we also can't be in this situation again. And so that investment that Ai-jen is talking about, it comes, and I think what follows from it is a reimagination of how we have taken on this problem. It is possible to pay our workers living wages and get them the support that they need and the fair protection of our laws. And it is possible to name and understand that you can get to universal childcare in a way that has an important and significant government role, because family per family, each family shouldn't be in the situation that they are in right now, scrambling to figure out whether they're going to work next week because schools have started virtually, because they don't have care situations for their children. That's the situation that we are in right now, especially for lower income families who can't just sort of stand up an alternative plan with their extra pot of money. That is not a sustainable situation for families, and it's not a sustainable situation really for our functioning economy.
Thank you so much for those remarks. I was wondering, we are in the philanthropic community, so what do you think philanthropy can do? So what's the role of philanthropy? What do we need to be doing right now to really seize this small window of opportunity?
Well, I have to say that I have been super inspired by the way many parts of philanthropy have shown up in this period, who've sort of thrown out the usual rules that apply, right? Have said now is not the time to have organizations who are on the front lines of this crisis spending all of their time creating very tailored proposals and very tailored reporting outcomes. How do we make it easier to resource the field that is doing the work? And that is a critical thing for philanthropy to be doing. A second thing is to resource the organizations that are actually doing the work and do it quickly. Sometimes we've had moments that you might call movement moments. And the question people are asking is, how long will this last? Is this a thing that's going to continue? one of the ways to continue is to be able to have philanthropy lean into the moments as they are happening, not a year from now or not 2 years from now getting it started. The time really is now. The visibility on the issue of care is at a point where I really haven't seen in terms of people understanding all different facets of it. And this is after many, many decades, as Ai-jen said, of work, of people leading and organizing and actually naming many of the same problems. So now is the time to invest and invest in ways that are meaningful.
Yeah, and I would just add that the investments should be on everything from policy and research to grassroots organizing and engagement of workers. And that it's so important for workers to really be at the table in defining these visions for the future. How can we support care workers to be a part of setting new norms for the care landscape as it's shifting, as people are starting to pod, and all the whole childcare landscape is really shifting? And how do we make sure that care workers don't get lost in that, but actually have a role in shaping what that looks like? And that happens through organizing and really building the power and leadership and capacity of workers themselves to be at the table. And one thing I'll just mention, which I'm really, really excited about, is at NDWA 5 years ago, we created a Black domestic worker organizing program called We Dream in Black to really support the leadership and organizing of Black domestic workers in particular all over the country. And 5 years later, on Monday, they're going to be launching an agenda called the Unbossed Agenda in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm. I know, it's so exciting. And it's basically a vision for the next 5 years for what it looks like for Black domestic workers to truly have their work respected, recognized, and who they are as whole human beings, being able to live and work with dignity. And so that's going to be launched on Monday. And it's a really exciting milestone, especially in light of how Black domestic workers have been affected and on the front lines of the pandemic, and especially in this moment for Black lives and the momentum that this movement has for us to be able to make these connections between what is happening and who is on the front lines of our economic crises, and how racism and anti-Black racism has really shaped our economy, and then who then needs to have a seat at the table really shaping our solutions for the future. So I just wanted to mention that because we're really excited about that at NDWA.
That's definitely so exciting. Thank you for sharing with all of us. We'll keep an eye on Monday to see the agenda and also to share on social media. Well, I think those are the questions that I have in mind. It's been so inspiring to hear about your work and your commitment to advance policies that really support immigrant women and women of color. And now I am excited to continue the conversation with the questions from all of you in the audience. Mercy Chico, our communications manager, will support us with that. You have been putting your questions in the chat box. Please continue putting them as you think of them, while Mercy begins with the first one.
Great, thank you, Claudia. So we have a question from Emmy. It says, how has the Women's Foundation had to pivot during this challenging time to support grantee partners?
So we did several things of what Fatima was mentioning. We are no longer requiring burdensome applications. We only have conversations with our grantees, and we, from that, started to create all of the applications for them. We are giving them general operating support so they can use the money for whatever they think is best. If they propose something in the conversation they have with us, but at the last minute they realize they need to shift it, They have complete flexibility. We are also not doing a lot of reporting like we used to do in the past, and we have mobilized money in a much faster way. And we really want to also center women and girls of color in our work. And as Ai-jen was sharing, we want them to be at the table shaping the decisions that we are making. So we are trying to ensure that they receive support for what they need.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So next question here is from Diana. Diana Alonzo Watkins would like to know, thanks so much panelists for the active discussion. In many ways, the workplace itself has to fundamentally change into a caretaking model to support women of color in particular. However, many cities that are majority women and also majority people of color, such as DC, still maintain a work environment that's essentially a white patriarchal environment. What are some of the transformational policies that can be built into the city and within the nonprofit sector, especially to break out of this?
Well, one of the things that I think has been a important and useful thing is the storytelling that has happened, that has opened an opportunity for people to not only name their experiences, but to name what would make a difference for them at work, right? And the change of sort of policies and rules, that can be changed, that can happen somewhat fast in nonprofits, maybe not as fast as people would like. The change that is harder and most essential, and that I think that where I would hope most people are leaning right now, is the change around culture. Organizations are made up of people, and people will remember how they feel working at that organization. And it is not change that happens overnight, but it is change that comes from leadership, right? The culture of an organization does not change on its own. It has to be really prompted and intentional with leadership. And I think that work, sometimes it takes a shaking up for that work to happen intentionally and serious with a dedicated commitment. And I believe we are in the midst of that sort of reckoning that will lead to those sorts of cultural changes, so that people who are doing the work, because they come to the work as social justice warriors with deep passion, that they can stay in the work because they're valued people.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just had one other idea that's a little bit different. In our movement, one of the things that we've been able to do at the city level that's been really exciting is win a municipal bills of rights for domestic workers that establish what we call standards boards. And what a standards board is basically a table that gets set by the city government that brings together employers, domestic workers, and the city government to actually set standards and norms together. And for workers to have a seat at the table to talk about everything from, having written agreements about the terms of the employment, to paid time off, to wages. I think it's a powerful thing to create a voice in that systematic way, and that mechanism for workers to actually shape policy and norms at the city level. I feel like it's powerful. In Philadelphia, it's taking off, and in Seattle, it's taking off. And I'm hopeful that it can be a model for women and for essential workers and for other workers who have not had a voice in shaping local policy to start being able to shape culture and policy in a different way.
Awesome. So next question from Anonymous. What has been your biggest challenge as an organization during the pandemic?
I mean, it's hard to just name one. But one of the things that I will say, because this is a conversation we've been having around care, is the issue of care for people who work at the National Women's Law Center. About a third of our staff have young children in elementary school or younger. And were immediately activated to engage with policymakers in the field around relief packages, and we're working extraordinary hours and extraordinarily hard, and we're doing it on top of homeschooling and parenting, and it's not sustainable, right? And so part of that challenge, which is a challenge people are facing everywhere, although I would say as an organization that is heavily dominated with women's staff, it also highlights how the questions around how to resolve care crises and care challenges often fall to women. And so people were feeling that pretty deeply.
Absolutely. We are feeling that as well. And I would just add, at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we are majority women of color and all powered by women of color. And our base, our membership, our community is women of color, and lots of Black women, undocumented women, women who came into this pandemic with a tremendous amount of insecurity and hardship. And so we have this reality that our staff, especially organizers who are interacting with workers every day, are absorbing the incredible pain and suffering. And I think people feeling like, how are we going to meet the incredible need out there? And the need is about basic survival, and there is actually trauma in that having to absorb that pain, and in addition to their own families, as Fatima mentioned, their own caregiving responsibilities and their own, we have staff who've lost family members to COVID. We have had staff who have contracted COVID. And so it's on multiple fronts. And then at the same time, we're witnessing these ongoing cases of police and vigilante violence, and the pain of that every time. And the fact that we still haven't been able to address it in a systemic way is, again, compounding the incredible wounds and trauma of this time. And so I just think it cannot be overstated how difficult it is to be doing this work in this time. In some ways, I think, I imagine, I've never worked in a war zone before, but I do imagine that for humanitarian aid workers in war zones, that this kind of constant onslaught and absorption of human suffering at the most visceral level, right, is kind of what's happened and what is happening now with us. And so I just think, that piece around healing, around care, around support, we actually have to think about new approaches to account for it, to address it, to speak to it, and to hold the really important people who are at the heart and soul of this work.
I think for me, as a mother of a 2-year-old, all of what you're mentioning, it really resonates with me. I want to also share that I have been really lucky and fortunate to work in an organization that really values care and that understands that we need some flexibility. And I have only been able to be able to do my work during this time because I have that flexibility, and my husband also that supports me.
Support is very important, as is flexibility.
Yeah, but although support part of the challenge right now is that support looks very different in COVID times. Mm-hmm. So people not only lost whatever situation they had in place, in many cases they lost their whole village that was making things possible all at once, right? That so they can't see their family and close friends in typical ways. And we as a community are holding so much collective grief. It's unlike anything. Maybe it's like a war zone. I don't know, but it is unlike anything I have experienced. And I often, to go back to the point you made earlier about Tirana's thoughts around healing in action and action in healing, and there is something there around how we sustain ourselves in this period.
Yeah, I've been wondering if we need to think about it as like a baton relay race where, as we kind of hold on and do the work, if we ourselves sense that we need a break to step away, and to take care of ourselves and our families, that we're able to pass the baton, and that there's always a set of us who are able to kind of take it up and really think intentionally about how we're setting up those systems and mechanisms. Because I do think that this is, we are in an unprecedented time, and this is a very intense time. And I do think we're living through a period of volatility and crisis, and women of color are going to be, in many ways, on the front lines, both as first responders and healers and organizers and leaders, but also as people who are forced to bear the burden of all the inequities that these crises reveal. And so I just think it's so important, the work that the Washington Area Women's Foundation does to support women of color and girls of color, because this is how we kind of shore up our ability to be resilient through this period of volatility and crisis, and enable us to seize some of the opportunity of the kind of disruption of this time, right? To move forward on social justice and social change goals when there are those moments to do so.
I like that analogy of a baton passing, because people often say, "Oh, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon." In many ways, it actually is a sprint, especially over these next
It's both,
months,
yeah,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you aren't sprinting by yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. We definitely aren't. I mean, I feel like if I didn't have people like Fatima and Tirana and Monica and my team at NDWA and Caring Across Generation, I mean, these are our squads where we know we're not alone, and they could not be more important. Yes, we have our own organizations, but we are so very much in this together, and it is part of what keeps us strong and resilient through these times.
Thank you. We appreciate the analogy as well. Feel free to pass the baton this way. So here we have another question. Do either Fatima or Ai-jen have lessons learned from possibly well-intended talking points or policies that were pitched to support care workers but ended up being counterproductive?
Well, one danger when it comes to care that is a danger that we've just dealt with forever and ever is the ways in which families and workers get pitted against each other. We're told that there's no money and it's too expensive and it's so costly and care is so costly. And so this kind of scarcity, austerity, zero-sum culture and narrative that has allowed for our care systems to be completely divested and undervalued in our economy and in our society, that has made us so vulnerable in this time, right? That we have to push back against that. And I think we will face a time when we are told that there's no money and it's, there's, the budgets are tight and it's too costly, and we just have to push back and say no. If we can overnight have $500 billion in bailouts for corporations, we can bail out our care workers, full stop, and our families, full stop. And so I just think that that's a really big danger. And I'll just say that, when we were fighting for home care workers to be included in the minimum wage protections, it was such an important and historic moment because care workers, home care workers, were excluded from minimum wage protection. So until the Obama administration moved this regulatory change forward, it was perfectly legal in states across the country to pay home care workers less than the minimum wage for doing care work, for caring for the people who raised us and our loved ones with disabilities. Absolutely unacceptable. So we pushed for that regulatory change, but because there wasn't an increase in funding, there was a danger that if we raised wages, people's services would get cut. And that's the position that we've always been put in. And that is a position we have to refuse. People cannot get their services cut. In fact, people have to have more services. These services should be universally accessible, full stop. And every care job should be a living wage job with benefits so that the workforce can sustain doing this work, full stop. And so I think that that's the danger, that's the threat, and that's what always happens. We always get pushed into a corner, and I think we have to just draw a line in the sand and say no more. Post-pandemic, that's it, period.
Fatima, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share?
Well, the only other thing that I think we are for sure going to be dealing with the austerity caucus actually pretty soon. And we are already seeing that come. So I think that Ai-jen is definitely right about that. I mean, listen, there are some old narratives that I think people have been surprised how sticky they were and that we have never fully shared that really hold us back. And one of those things is that sort of your ability to find childcare and effectively solve your care, whatever your care challenge is some sort of personal problem that you're either really good at solving or really bad at solving, rather than understanding that it is actually infrastructure for economies, jobs, and communities to function successfully. So we've allowed that to be this sort of personal problem narrative, and shedding that is going to be really, really tough. And related to that, there has been a narrative that is very much steeped in race and sex bias and our long history of racism about care workers and about that critical work. I mean, in general, you are trusting your most important and valuable people to a set of people. And it is not just someone you randomly picked up off the street. It is someone who should be valued accordingly. And the wages that Ai-jen has talked about, the conditions of work, all of that has flown from a long-standing racist and sexist narrative that is actually free labor or not labor, that is steeped in our history and legacy of slavery.
That's
and
right.
So shedding historical stories about care workers effectively when they are ingrained in 400 years of the way our society has operated is not an easy task at all. And it actually requires affirmatively telling new stories and having people understand the race and sexist history that undergirds it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, Claudia. We had one more question here. Speaking of care, I thought everyone would enjoy answering. How are you all staying sane or practicing self-care during the pandemic? And then I'll turn it over to you, Claudia.
This is a question that I've been getting so much. So a couple of things. I'm very lucky that I can, like, I've basically called in all the troops for help. You know, I have my yoga, I take online yoga classes, I make sure that I have time to drink wine over Zoom with my friends. And I have a therapist who's been essential. So I'm not afraid to talk about that. And as an organizer, my most important form of self-care is winning. Like I want to win justice and dignity and respect for women and women of color, in particular for our workforce who've been so heroic in this time. And I think we've got to do it. We've got to just figure out how we move through this time and make the structural shifts that we have to make in order to prevent these disasters from happening in the future. And I will feel so cared for when we win.
So I really relate to Ai-jen's last point about half of Black women are unemployed right now. And COVID has hit my family personally. It's hit my network deeply. And it is like a great privilege, frankly, to be able to do this work. And I feel a real responsibility with it. And I know if I were not actively doing this work, I would be calling everyone I knew, asking them, how do I help? What, you know, that's the thing that would keep me up at night. So I have to say that that is a part of my own care. I am also Team Peloton. I don't actually have a bike. I would love a bike, but I just like use the app, and it is grounding, and there's community in it. There's this Black girl magic part of it that is the most amazing thing. And I've been able to ground myself more deeply with my family. You know, I'm doing all sorts of things that I hope will be hangovers well after we're in a very different phase, that have me more deeply connected with my parents, with my sisters, with close friends, with my children and my husband. Like that has been a really important part of the care for me.
Thank you so much for your insights. I'm going to share quickly that the closest things I'm doing to self-care is exercising and playing with my child as much as I can. It's a joy to have him home. And I think thank you so much again for sharing your thoughts and your conversation. We are very inspired by your leadership, and we are so happy that you are doing what you are doing. And I hope that we can be winning together. You are really champions for women and girls, and we will follow all of the work that you are doing and really continue supporting you however we can. Thank you everyone for joining us for this conversation. We will be having more conversations like these during the fall, and please feel free to check our website where we have blogs and more conversations with more women leaders. And please check out our Stand Together form to learn more on how to donate and to participate to support care workers. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much.